Hello, and welcome to SFMA's post-conference education session. Today, Dr. Greg Munshaw will be presenting Turfgrass Basics, Turfgrass 101, focusing on the basics. I'm Jennifer McClendon, SFMA's education manager. Dr. Munshaw is the director of agronomy for Park Research and Consulting. He has worked in the turfgrass industry for the past 30 years. He will be presenting Turfgrass 101, focusing on the basics. We will have question and answers throughout, and we will also take questions at the end. Dr. Munshaw?
Thanks, Jennifer. Yes, by all means, if you have questions as we're going along, raise your hand or type a question in the chat or whatever you need to do to get your question out there. And then Jennifer will relay it to me and then we'll talk about it. But great to be with you today. I missed last week and I hated to do so. As many of you all know, my wife is sick and so just wasn't able to get away. But I'm glad to be able to meet with you today and talk through some of these things that we'll go through today. And some of the stuff I'm a huge believer in, and you'll see maybe some of that as we get into some of this stuff. But the world's changing. That's what I can tell you. The world is changing, and we don't need to be left behind. And so a lot of the basic things that we've been doing in turf management for the last 100 years or whatever certainly still apply, but maybe even some of the things that we've stopped doing may come back around because we're going to be losing other tools as we move forward. And so it's going to be an interesting next 10 years, I'd say, in this industry, but we'll talk about some of that stuff as we move through today. But just really quickly, as most of you all know, I left the University of Kentucky in 2020 and moved over to Mountain View Seeds, and then have since that time still work for that same parent company, but have developed this research farm in Missouri. And just wanted to kind of give you a little update here of what we've got going on and what we're into. And so we've got about 20 acres here, same size farm as I had at the University of Kentucky, and obviously developing small blocks and large plots of different grasses. We've got warm seasons and cool seasons. We can see on the left side there, we've got a shop that now has siding and a roof on it. So we're coming along and really moving forward with our mission of testing out products and different ways of doing things, and working with soils and all sorts of different things on this site. So that's a little glimpse into my world. All right, so turf grasses, how in the world did they get here? Right, so two kind of schools of thought, right? So there was a zap by some creator. If you look at the Bible, it says, and God said, let the earth bring forth grass, and the earth brought forth grass. The other school of thought is that there was a big bang and everything developed on the planet from that big bang. And so I'm not here to convince you one way or the other. That's not my job. But either way you look at this, it takes a leap of faith to believe that, there was a creator or that there was a big bang. We weren't there. We don't know. And so one of the ways we got grass on this planet. All right. And so obviously grass is our plant of choice. But why is it our plant of choice? Have you ever thought about this? Why don't we play soccer or football or baseball on a field of daisies? Right? Think about that. Why not? So it'd be interesting, right? I mean, if you try to kick a soccer ball through there, probably not too effective, probably not going to get great ball roll. Football, I think, might be interesting. Baseball could be interesting too with ball hops and stuff, but we don't use a field of daisies because it would be totally different world of sports if this is what we had to play on. But if you went through and mowed those daisies down short like our grasses are, what would happen to those daisies? Well, so that's the tricky part, right? Because every other plant pretty much on the planet, and if you can see my cursor here, has a growth point on the top of the plant. When we mow it off, growing up stops. And so that makes it really tricky to use anything but grass. All right, grass growth point is actually down at the bottom of the plant and it's pushing the leaf up the plant. And so when we mow it off, the growth point is down there. So it's all good. And so that's obviously why grass is our plant of choice. And so because our grass grows from the bottom up, when we mow it or when an animal grazes it off or whatever, it really is just a little wound to the plant and we'll recover from it. We didn't lose a growth point or a meristem when this happened. All right, turfgrass adaptation. You've all seen this multiple times. You've all heard Dr. Powell's joke about the transition zone, but I've got to continue it on. But up north, obviously the grasses of choice are cool season grasses because we've got cold winters and warm summers. So it's cool season grasses pretty much wall to wall. Down south, where they've got hot summers and warm winters, it's all warm season grasses, right? And then in the transition zone, they've got cold winters, hot summers. And so what's the best grass of choice in the transition zone? Well, there's not a good choice. This is the one place on the planet where we can grow all grasses equally poorly. So it's tough in the transition zone because of the hot and the cold. But this line, this transition zone line, is now getting moved around because you've heard of Bermuda grass going in Chicago and bluegrass in Atlanta. So things are changing, and part of that is because of the new genetics that are coming out with better and better plant material all the time. But in general, like I said, the plant adaptation is broken down in those three different zones. All right, so plant identity, grass ID is really important to me. I think you've got to know what you're working on, because if you don't, what in the world do you do to the plant? How much do you fertilize? What chemicals can you use on it? What height should it be mowed at? All of those things you need to be able to know. Also, whatever weeds are prevalent in your area, those are a good thing to be up on as well, because again, knowing how to treat those weeds is really important. And then if you have a superior ever come out and say, hey, you know, what is this other plant that's growing in our Bermuda grass or bluegrass or whatever, you can tell them that it's, you know, such and such, and we are controlling it this way. And so if you're not an aficionado on plant identification, that's something that I would encourage you to spend some time on and, you know, really get to know the plants that you're working with, because it really is a good thing to know all of these different things. Here's a little shameless plug for me. This is my YouTube channel, some videos that I made while I was at the university on grass identification. So I've got a bunch of different grasses on there, but and just a general one here of what to look for, the different plant parts, and how we do identify grasses. All right. When your parents or kids or athletes or whatever see a sign like this, how excited does that make them? Probably not super excited, right? This is the sign that everybody just hates. It doesn't matter what chemical you're applying at all. If they see this, you are poisoning their children, you are poisoning their animals, you are poisoning the earth, because we've got this skull and crossbones sign up on the grass. And so I think one of the reasons why grass gets a bad name is because of signs like this, right? We have to warn people to not enter an area. But, you know, if there's a sign there, people just assume that we are applying really horrible materials and that we should stop that because it's a bad thing for the planet. Well, whether that's the case or not, it doesn't matter. It's all a perception thing. But this perception thing has got a lot of steam behind it. So if you look around the internet, there is a whole bunch of information on why or how or what's going on with changing times of chemicals and fertilizers. So we've got Wisconsin fertilizer bans. We've got up in the right corner here, the USA lags behind other countries on banning harmful pesticides. And that's kind of a big deal, right? For one thing, what is a harmful pesticide? But two, why aren't we banning them, or why are other countries banning them? Florida fertilizer bans in the summertime. Cities limiting use of lawn fertilizers and pesticides. water restrictions in Georgia on football fields, pesticide bans in Canada. The one I like the best here is this one in the top left corner there from Montgomery County, Maryland. My good buddy Jason Bowers is a grass grower up there, and he tells me it's an interesting place to grow grass because they just basically don't get to use anything to manage grass. But their little slogan there is, "We're not raising grass, we're raising families." It just makes me vomit every time I see that little ad. And so I'm all for changing times and making things better and safer and all that stuff, but making grass the enemy to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense. All right, we are not advancing. There we go. All right. So everything you need to grow grass is right here. Makes it really simple, doesn't it? You need soil. You need adequate temperatures for whatever you're growing. You need sunshine. You need water, and you need air. Having a green thumb is just kind of the icing on the cake, but these other things are the things you have to make sure that you can grow grass. If something gets out of whack, if your grass starts to look bad, because of the huge influence that your soil, your sunlight, your water, your air have on, or even temperature have on how your grass is doing, that's the one thing I would look at first is what of these things is maybe a little bit out of whack, and is that why my grass is starting to look bad? So, is there something in my soil? Has the temperature changed? Is it cloudy? Do I have enough water? Is there shade issues? All of these things obviously are going to affect how your grass is growing. And so before you start tweaking your products and all of that stuff, I would look at all of these basic things to see, are all these things okay? Is everything okay in terms of sunlight and water and all that stuff? And so when it comes to growing grass, I really do think, let's keep it simple. There's really no reason to get crazy with, all of these different things that we can do, because the grass most of the time doesn't really care about it. It just wants the basics to keep it healthy. All right. So photosynthesis is one of those things that obviously critically important. This has got to happen or else plants don't grow. We're not here, animals aren't here, nothing's here if photosynthesis doesn't happen. But it's absolutely just a miraculous pathway that creates sugar from air and water. It's just crazy. So carbon dioxide that we're breathing out of our bodies right now, plus water that the plant takes in from the soil, in the presence of sunlight, makes glucose, a sugar, and then oxygen, which obviously we need as a waste product, which is just crazy. You think about things brought in from the environment and then just sun shining, making chemical energy from solar energy to turn processes in the plant and make sugar. It's just absolutely nuts. So things that we need to think about with photosynthesis. So on the top right there, we've got the whole kind of process of how photosynthesis works in cool season grasses. So light shines down, it's captured by the chloroplasts, and the solar energy is turned into chemical energy to turn this Calvin cycle over on the right side there. Water is split, and oxygen is the waste of that water being split. And then as this cycle turns, this Calvin cycle, sugar is made as carbon dioxide is brought into the plant. And the enzyme that brings this in is a thing called rubisco, which will bring in carbon dioxide into the cycle, but it also can bring in oxygen. And because of that, that throws a little bit of a wrench into the gears. And so here's what's going on. On the bottom side of a leaf, we've got these little pores called a stomate. These things will open and close depending on time of day or how hot the plant is or how dry the soil is. Those kind of things, the plant will open these things up or close them down. If they're open, carbon dioxide and whatever else is in the air is coming into the plant. And then obviously coming out of the plant is water vapor as it moves up from the soil through the plant and then out. If they're closed, water can't come out, air can't come in. And so that's where things get a little bit tricky. If the plant senses it's hot and dry, it closes these stomates up. And then if the stomates are closed, then carbon dioxide does not come into the plant. And then this little cycle right here that wants to bring in carbon dioxide to make sugar actually then starts to bring in oxygen and doesn't make sugar. And that is a huge deal for us. And so whenever these stomates close, so drought will close them, heat will close them. Whenever they close, we run into problems. And then shade, this is some work out of the University of Arkansas, just showing how much photosynthesis is reduced by shade. You can see a pretty good fall off there. And so obviously plants need sunlight to make sure that this stuff happens. And the more shade you've got, the more issues you've got. Good example of this is this University of Louisville soccer pitch, and beautiful facility, absolutely gorgeous. And Mike there does a great job of keeping his Bermuda grass looking pristine all the time. But they've got, because of this overhang, this roof, they've got a shaded area all the way down where the players stand. And it never, ever gets thick. And it's always struggling because it's always in shade, especially in the wintertime. And so it's just an area, because he doesn't have the light, that his grass is always thinning out. And, coaches and stuff are complaining because, well, why doesn't the grass look good here? Well, look at where you're standing and there's no light here. So, how's the grass going to grow? But those are the kind of things that we have to deal with, that somebody else put on us, that, we just have to kind of figure out a way around. So things to think about with photosynthesis: pay attention to your soil moisture. If you're getting dry, obviously, get some water down there so your plants aren't going to close up their stomates if they don't need to. If you've got a shady situation, maybe raise the mowing height a little bit, maybe back off on your fertilizer and water a little bit, and let them grow up to try and have a little bit more leaf area to capture some more light if possible. So C3 grasses, if we improve the air movement around them, which is tough in a stadium, but there's little around each leaf that we've got a thing called a boundary layer. That's just a water vapor around each leaf. And if we can get that to blow away with air or wind or fans or whatever, it's easier for gases to come into the leaf and water to come out of the leaf. And so that's improving air movement can really help grasses out. And then syringing to cool things down is also a good thing to do. All right, so we talked about this oxygen thing. When the stomates close, what's going on? All right, so a lot of you, especially if you're in a fairly warm area, are going to have a time in the summertime when your fields are just going to struggle, your cool season fields. And a lot of it is to do with this whole thing with the stomates closing and oxygen being in the leaf and no more carbon dioxide coming in. And so this ribisco enzyme that I talked about, which is the most abundant protein on the planet, it fixes oxygen as well as carbon dioxide. So it's just as much likes oxygen as it does carbon dioxide. And if carbon dioxide is not coming in and oxygen's there, it's going to use it. So this whole cycle of photorespiration does not make energy, which is bad. It wastes energy, and it loses carbon dioxide, which obviously we need for sugar to make plants grow. So big waste. All right, so this is kind of what's going on. Regular cycle, carbon dioxide's coming in over here, making sugar as this thing spins around. On photorespiration, oxygen's coming in. We don't make sugar, we lose carbon dioxide, and we waste energy to process this. And so absolutely big waste, but this is why your plants are struggling. Your cool season plants are struggling, because we've got this thing going on that's just it's a bad process. C4 plants don't have this, thankfully. And so during the summertime, when it gets hot and dry, they're cranking along. And they have the ability to close their stomates up almost entirely and still let some CO2 in and some water out without huge amounts being lost. And so really baby your cool season plants as you get into the summertime. Anything you can do to cool them down, thinking about that photorespiration is going to help them out and help them to produce sugar so they can continue to grow throughout those tough times. All right, moving over to soils. So when I was in school, man, I hated soils so bad. I just couldn't stand taking soils classes. It wasn't interesting to me. And I I took them because I had to for my major, but when I got into graduate school, I took less and less. And then by the time I was doing my PhD, I didn't do any soils classes during that time. And as soon as I started teaching, I was like, man, I sure wish I would have had more soils classes, because I realized that the whole world revolves around soils, whether I liked it or not. And so over the next 7.5 years that I was at Mississippi State, Dr. Stewart basically taught me soil science. I'd go to his office and I'd say, what is this? And what is this? And so, now I'm a big soils nerd, and, want to get more and more into soil health, because I see how important soils are to what we do. It's not just about the plant. It's a lot of times about what's below the plant that we can't see. So soils, obviously living things, dead things, lots of carbon in there. Gases, we've got carbon dioxide being released from the plant. We've got methane gas. We've got oxygen. Obviously, nutrients and water are in the soil, and that's where the plant is going to get the vast majority of its nutrients, and obviously all of its water. And then obviously the soil is really good for anchoring our plants down. All right, so determining your soil texture, if you've got a sand, a sieve test is our best way of knowing, how much sand we've got, or what kind of sand it is, or if it's, a lot of gravel in it or whatever. I like the water settling method, the jar test, just dumping some of your soil into a jar and shaking it up, and then the heavy stuff falls out first, and then the lighter stuff, and then the lighter stuff on top of that. And you can measure each section and divide it by the total area of your different soil layers, and figure out what percent of sand, silt, and clay do I have on my field. And then the other people the people that are really into soils will just grab some soil, wet it down, and make a ribbon, and kind of figure out how much clay they've got in their soil by just squeezing it between their thumb and forefinger. But that's something that I've never been great at. I can tell you that it's either sandy or clayey, but it's certainly not, that it's a silty clay loam or anything like that. All right, so a little bit of a refresher on sands and clays here. Obviously, sand, large particles versus very small particles with clay. Low nutrient holding with sand, medium nutrient holding with clays. Compaction resistant sands, clays will compact. Low water holder for sands, high water holder clays. Water moves through soil in sands and does not with clays. And then we've got lots of air spaces with sands, and we don't with clays. We also can have poor aggregation. So the soil that are in this guy's hand right here, that is aggregated clay particles that are all stuck together to make bigger soil size, maybe sand size particles, versus just the individual tiny little clay particles that are up here in this pile. And so we like aggregation. We want to focus on aggregation, because if we have a clayey soil or a heavier soil, we want to make sure that we've got aggregation, because this is what's going to give us drainage. It's going to give us air spaces that the plant needs to grow. And for microbes in the soil, they need to have air spaces. And so things that we can do to promote aggregation are really important. So improving both of these soils, you can do that by adding some organic material. So sands, we're going to get better nutrient water holding capacity, and think about a USGA spec sand in this kind of a situation. If you've got straight sand, that's a hard medium to be growing grass on. I've done it a few times, and man, I struggle every time I've done it. But if you've got some organic in there with it, it makes it a much easier process. Clays, if you add some organic material to them, that can help with this aggregation process to make the clay particles, individual particles, to start cementing them together to form these aggregates that we want to see. So in a perfect world, this is what we'd have for our soil. Half of it would be the actual solids, the soil part of it. So the different soil parts, and then the about 5%-ish organic material. And then half of it would be open for air and water. So the issue is then, as soon as we start mowing or playing or walking or anything on a grass field, we start pushing soil particles together, and this air and water space becomes less and less, and our solids become more. So our bulk density increases. And so these things get out of whack. We don't have the airspace that the plant has to have the air in there for root growth to happen. And then obviously the plant has to have water in there. And the more and more compacted, compressed our soil becomes, the less spaces we've got in our soil for those things. So this illustration here is the best thing I've ever seen to show how bad compaction can be. So the tube on the right there, highly compacted. You can see the plant up above ground is struggling, and we've got just a tiny little bit of roots at the very top of that tube. Medium compaction, the plant is doing so-so, but roots are still struggling. They're certainly deeper than high compaction, but they're not very deep. And then not compacted at all, plants thriving, and roots are all the way down through that test tube. And so these are things that we don't see, right? We don't necessarily always know, is my soil hard enough to limit my root production? And if it is limiting my root production, what does that mean for the top of the plant? Obviously something, as you can see there in the middle. And then what does it mean for nutrient and water uptake? Obviously something. The roots aren't down deep to find more minerals or water. And so obviously we need softer soils, but we need them for several reasons. We need them for oxygen in the soil for roots to grow. There's a process called respiration where the sugar from photosynthesis gets broken down. And for respiration to happen, to make energy, oxygen is involved in that. Carbon dioxide is the waste product from that. And so gas exchange, the CO2 needs to get out and oxygen needs to get into the soil. And then same thing with microbes. Microbes have to have oxygen in the soil to be able to function, to make your soil healthier. And so we've got to make sure that, our fields are going to get compacted. There's just no way around it. But we've got to make sure that we get in there and do something about this compaction to make sure that it does not affect our root production and our microbial populations. So to fix this situation, we got to aerify for compaction. We can aerify for thatch. We can aerify to increase soil oxygen. And if we've got drainage issues, then that is going to help with soil oxygen as well. So things to improve your soil is just punching holes or putting in some drainage. So how do you know if you need to aerify? Well, I think most of us can figure out, if you're walking on concrete, you can feel underfoot how hard that surface is versus if you're walking on something soft. Over time, if your surface of your field is hard or if it's not hard, and you can get a pretty good feel for that. Penetrometers, I have no issues with. The pocket knife test, I like that as well. I use that quite a bit on my own grass. And just, with the force of your thumb, if you can push your knife into a moist soil, then it's probably not compact enough to have to really worry about. Thatch, as you can see in the top right corner there, excessive thatch, obviously that's an issue. Roots or plants in general are just lazy, right? If there's a easy to grow area like a thatch, the roots are just going to kind of hang out in that area. And then if it gets hot and dry, we're in trouble because our roots are all at the top. So we want to minimize our thatch because of that, and because of disease and insects and all sorts of things that will hang out in our thatch layer, but then also layering. And I've seen quite a bit of layering on fields over the years. And this is a putting green in the top left there, but you see with people going out with different sands or different materials of top dressing over time, you get layers built up in the soil, and basically you're creating a whole bunch of different perched water tables, and it makes it almost impossible to get any water moving down through that profile. And so we've got to punch through that to break those up and to start water moving down through to drain again. All right, compaction, that picture at the top there, obviously an area where somebody has driven over and over and over day after day after day. And what we see there is several different things. One thing is we can see tire tracks. So we know that it's some kind of a vehicle doing it. We can see that it's compressed, right? So our soil is physically pushed down, so it has to be compacted. We can see that the plants are gone, whether that they're just worn off from the tires being, trafficked on them and wearing them out, or if it's from the compacted hard soils thinning them out. Either way, they're gone. The other thing we see is that it's wet, right? So we've got a little bowl there, and we know compacted soils don't drain very well because we lose our airspace. And so it's going to hold moisture more so than other areas. Also, wet soils will compact easier than dry soils. And so we've got this issue where they stay wet. We go drive over them again and they compact more. And it's just kind of a never ending process until we don't have any pore space left in our soil whatsoever. So obviously not a good situation to have no pore space because we're not going to have any oxygen in our soil. We're not going to have drainage because of it. The picture in the middle there, if you've ever pulled a potted plant out of the pot and you've seen the roots kind of wrapped around like that, that's kind of what our roots will do if they hit a hard layer in the soil. Our roots aren't just going to drill through that layer. They hit that hard layer and they'll just kind of start growing sideways. And so obviously our depth can be limited by compacted or hard layers in the soil. A lot of times in compacted soils, you'll see things like knotweed or annual bluegrass or algae thriving in those areas, especially as our plants start to thin out. Those plants will handle the compacted soils and they don't have competition from our turf grasses. And so they just thrive. And then obviously we've got to think about with a hard soil, what does that mean for the people that are using our facilities? If it's super hard and somebody goes down and lands on their knee, what happens? And so keeping things on the softer side, at least to some degree, is obviously going to be somewhat safer for them. So how to fix it? Any one of these awesome aerification techniques will fix your problem. Guaranteed. Maybe not. So all of these things I found on Amazon, and I'm not sure how much good any of them do. Maybe the one on the bottom right there that actually looks like it'll pull a core, but can you imagine doing a whole field or even a whole lawn with that? I think that would be a localized dry spot kind of a fix to me. The guy in the middle there with the shoes, maybe that does a little bit of short-term good by making these solid tines, but how much area are you really covering? Over time, if this is all you do, solid tines will actually increase your compaction. And I'd be more concerned with stabbing my other leg with those spikes than anything else. Those two other things on the left there, I don't think they'll do anything at all. I don't know that they'd have enough weight to really get into the soil. So yeah, don't go with the gimmicks. I don't know that they're going to do a whole lot for you. And then I've got an issue with these as well. And I know that there's a lot of high school fields out there that have this type of aerifier because that's what was in the budget. But time after time after time, I see that the core that's pulled from this is tiny, like you can see in the top right there. We're really not getting deep into the soil with most of these machines. If this is all you have, if this is the best you've got, get as much weight on there to and wet the soil down to make sure that that machine can get as deep into the soil as possible to try and get more of a core or a plug pulled out. Really, to move to something like this is really important to make sure that we're staying on top of compaction and taking care of our thatch, especially if you've got a thatchy grass like a bluegrass or a Bermuda grass. All right, so a lot of benefits for aerification. Water will move into the soil, will move through the soil. We've got air spaces in the soil. Gases that are trapped in the soil can be released. Thatch gets broken down and physically removed from aerification, and we're removing the compaction itself as well. So obviously, because of these things, we're going to get improved rooting. Things we got to think about though, the surface disruption. Obviously, this is not something you want to do right before your season starts or maybe even mid-season, because obviously there's going to be holes all over the place. And so the bad thing about what we do in sports turf is our agronomic practices are not dictated by what the plant necessarily needs. It's dictated by our season. And so you've got to work around your sports to figure out when you can fit this stuff in. The physical damage to the turf is obviously a critical thing as well. When your cool season grasses are undergoing photorespiration, they're under a lot of temperature stress in the summertime. That's probably not the best time to go in and punch holes. But depending on when your sports seasons are, that may be the only time that you can get in there and do that. And so it's really tough. But so ideally, you're going to aerify cool seasons in the spring and the fall. and warm seasons in the summertime. But depending on when you're using them, maybe you can do that, maybe you can't. If you're only going down with shallow tines, time after time after time, you can create a cultivation pan where you've got a hard layer at the 4-inch depth. And so going in with a deep tine every now and again to bust it up can be helpful for sure. Weed seeds can be brought up to the surface, and you can have a weed bloom following aerification sometimes. And then what are you doing with the cores? A lot of fields will just drag them up and break them up if they don't have too much thatch or things like that in the soil. But sometimes we have to shovel these things up, remove them, and get them off site. So what do you do with those things? It's not something that's super easy. And then if you try to fill low areas in your park with the cores, well, is it the same kind of grass? Are you putting Bermuda grass where there's a bunch of cool season or something like that? We've got to think about those kind of things. All right, so quality aerification. So in a perfect world, we're going to be punching, every time we punch, as many holes as we possibly can. Get your spacing as short together as you can get it, and get a whole bunch of holes. Ideally, you're going to cover about 20% of your turf per year. Ideally, I understand that's a lofty goal, and you're going to have large tines and short spacings to be able to do that. But in a perfect world, that's what would happen. But even if you're only getting 10%, it's still better than 0%. Making sure that your holes get in, like I said, using a good quality aerifier to make sure that you're getting some deep holes made. And then good tines. I've been in a lot of barns over the years where, the tines aren't great, or there's tines missing. Make sure that you've got some good tines. I understand they're expensive, but this is a really important practice for sports turf. And then we've got to keep doing this. This is not something you do one time and you're done. It's every year, multiple times a year. We need to be thinking about doing this to make sure that we're staying on top of our compaction issues and our thatch, and making sure that we're keeping our soil oxygen levels where they need to be to promote our microbial population. All right, switching gears over to nutrients. The plant itself is about 75 to 85% water. And so again, I think, thinking back to that first slide where I showed the things you need to grow grass, when you think about 75 to 85% of the plant itself is water, if something goes downhill, think about those major things. 15 to 25% of the plant is dry matter, made up of the nutrients that the plant has to have, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen from the air and water, and then obviously the nutrients out of the soil. And nutrients certainly can get bound up in the soil. Sometimes we, need to fertilize with specific things or specific products, or foliar feed sometimes, depending on what we're trying to apply. But a lot of times too, our nutrients are available in the soil. And if our plants are growing fine, we need to think about, well, what do I apply? If my plants are happy, if it looks good, if it's recovering, what do I apply? Do I apply? So there's the question. So I mentioned foliar feeding. I'm not against foliar feeding by any means, but I will say that the roots are much, much more effective of taking the nutrients into the plant than a leaf is. And when a nutrient is brought in through the leaf system, or excuse me, through the root system, it can move up through the xylem to anywhere in the plant and be turned into whatever chemical process that needs to happen. If it's brought through the leaf, typically the nutrient will just stay where it's entered through the leaf and be used there. And so it's not that it's bad, it's just not nearly as effective to get it through the leaf as it is from the roots. So I'm not poo-pooing using foliar products whatsoever. I'm just saying our soil applied products are more effective at getting into the plant. So here's the big question. Do you need to fertilize? And some of you might be scratching your head thinking, what the heck is this guy pushing? Well, I'm not pushing anything, but pay attention to what you're seeing, right? If you've got a bunch of clippings, if you've got good recovery, if your color is good, well, how much do you need to fertilize then, right? Do we just throw fertilizer to throw fertilizer, or, is it for some specific reason? Obviously, the reason for us is recovery and color and aesthetics. But if we've got that, how much do you keep pushing? And so, the textbooks will tell you Bermuda grass, apply a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per month. Well, what if my conditions aren't the same as what the conditions were from that author of that textbook? What if I've got spectacular soils and my grass grows much healthier than what has been seen? And so, or what if I'm on straight sand and I don't hold any nutrients? Well, then maybe I have to fertilize more. So, this is not something that is textbook. This is something that you go out, you figure out over time, what does my field need? Not what does a salesperson tell me or what does a textbook tell me. It's how is my grass responding to the wear and tear of everyday use on it? And then make your fertility decisions based on that, not based on anything else. But pay attention to it all. That's the key thing to it, is pay attention to how your grass is growing and how it's recovering. Which products should you use? It really depends. For tall areas on our farm, we'll just use the cheap ag stuff. But for our shortcut stuff that half inch or whatever, we'll buy some smaller SGN products. And then if you're even shorter than half inch, you need to get into some pretty small products. But it really depends on how tall your grass is and what is it for. I like a smaller particle sometimes to get better distribution of the particle around. But a lot of times, as long as the nutrients out there, it's going to get in the soil and it's generally going to do what it needs to do. Slow release products, I have no issues with them at all. I struggle a little bit with the plastic products, because what happens with that plastic? Does it break down? Does it not? Does it stay in the soil forever? I don't know. But other slow releases, I have no issues with. And then additional products, biostimulants, whatever. I'm not saying don't use those things. What I would say to you is make sure you've got your yard in order. Make sure that your fertility is right. Everything looks good. Spend your money on those things first. And then if you've got money left in your budget, by all means, do what you think you need to do. But I would spend my money on the critical things first and foremost, and then worry about things later. And then obviously timing is a factor as well, depending on if you're growing warm seasons or cool season grasses, and when you should be really applying the bulk of your fertility. Here's just kind of an example of looking, right? So Bermuda grass here that was applied with ammonium nitrate because it didn't look right. So, the kind of obvious thing here, it's off color. Let's apply nitrogen. And that nitrogen application, 2 pounds per 1,000, which is quite a bit, did not cause a greening response. But on the right there, 2 pounds of ammonium sulfate did cause a greening response. So obviously, sulfur was the limiting nutrient in this situation. And so sometimes it's that easy, right? It's put something out there and see how the grass responds to it. We'll talk a little bit about soil testing here, but I've got some questions about soil testing, and I don't really know the answer to some of this stuff. But so the kind of the traditional logic on soil testing is you should be testing every 1 to 3 years, depending on what your field your conditions are, and if it's sand versus native soil and all that stuff. But kind of the soil scientists today in turf are saying, get a baseline, figure out what you've got in your soil. And then if you see things, like this last slide, if you see colors going off like that on your grass, take a soil test and figure out, what's going on here. Is there something that's way out of whack? And so the issue is when you take a soil test recommendations are generated off of row crop research or forage research, not turf research. And so these are all just guesses as to what is adequate, what is excessive, what is low for your nutrient ranges. And so we don't know these answers. And so that's why I'm saying pay attention to things, see what the grass is doing, take soil tests for sure, no problem, but don't live and die on what that soil test is saying, because we don't know, is it adequate for Bermuda grass or even bluegrass or ryegrass or whatever. We don't have a clue because it might have been done in soybeans. And so keep that in mind when you do a soil test. I'm not saying don't do soil tests. I'm just saying, think about what you're being told when you get a soil test. So the things I look for in the soil test: pH, obviously a good thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Most of the time, though, we'll want to see in that low 6 range for most of the grasses that we're going to grow. Soluble salts are a good thing to look at. If our EC, electrical conductivity, is greater than 4 decisiemens per meter, we've got a saline soil, not a good thing. If our sodium absorption ratio is greater than 12, we're going to have deflocculation, or our aggregates, our cemented together clay particles, will start breaking down into individual particles. It's sodium replacing calcium and other polyvalent cations in the soil. So our nutrient levels, when you see recommendations, like down here, this says on a bent grass green, apply 0.5 to 0.75 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per growing month, beginning in fall, blah, blah, blah. How do they know that, right? They don't have a clue. It does say, though, and I agree with this completely, adjust nitrogen rate and timing to accommodate climatic conditions and management practices. And that's the critical thing off of this soil test, is think about it for your site. Yeah, that's a rule of thumb, those numbers that they're giving you there. But for your situation, what does your grass need? What does your soil need? The other thing I'll look on here is organic material. How much is in my soil? Because obviously that's going to improve my soil health, help my micronutrients out, but it's also going to break down and release nutrients to the soil. So here's why we care about pH, right? You've all seen this before, but if our grass, or if our pH is in the 6 to 7 range, all of our macronutrients listed here are mostly available in this 6 to 7 range, really 6 to 8, but because our grasses like to be in that low 6 range, if we're in this area somewhere, generally pretty good in good shape. If we get too low or too high, you can see that nutrients get tied up in the soil and just are not available. They're there, but they're not available to the plant. And so we want to keep our pH as neutral as we, or close to lowish neutral as we possibly can. All right, switching gears to irrigation real quick here. So irrigation, obviously an important thing. As I showed you, as part of the light reactions where light is being captured by the plant, water is split, and the electrons from that water being split are used to create energy. And that obviously is water from the soil. And so we've got to have water for photosynthesis to occur. Cooling a plant, water that moves up through the soil into the plant and out through the leaf, it will cool the plant down. So you think about yourself, when you go outside on a hot day, you start to sweat and water's coming out of your skin. It's the same thing with a leaf. Water starts to come out of the leaf, it evaporates it off, and it cools the plant down, just like sweat evaporating cools your body down. It's the exact same thing, cools the plants down. Solute movement, so nutrients that are coming into the plant will move up through the plant in water, in the xylem. Turgor pressure, so the picture on the top right there where you can see the footprints, obviously a starting to be a droughty situation there where your footprints don't spring back, is because there's not enough water in the plant to get the leaf to spring back there. So the turgor pressure is not high enough. And so if we irrigate, we should be able to get that turgor pressure back up. And when you walk over that grass, the grass will spring back after we've walked on it. And then obviously water is needed for the germination process to occur. So what can limit water absorption into your plant? Obviously root depth, how deep they are. So we looked at that already. Compaction can limit your root growth. And so if our depth is not very good, we're not going to find water. Our density, if you don't have a lot of roots, obviously that can be a factor. And then vigor, how much they're growing. So again, is respiration happening that needs oxygen in the soil to get our roots really punching down and going into the soil? Your soil type is a factor here too. If you're on a straight sand that doesn't have very much water holding capacity, if any, well, that can limit your water absorption. If there's hardly any water held there, it's going to be hard to get water to those plants. If you've got a clayey soil, maybe it's too wet. That's something to think about as well. Water infiltration rate, how quickly water gets in, can be a factor here, obviously, as well. If it doesn't get into the soil, the roots can't get it very well. Compaction, we've talked about that, how that impacts things. And so we can manage most of this stuff by improving our soils, by making sure that we're aerifying, making sure that there's organic material in our soil, we can have better root depth, root density, root vigor. We can have less compaction. We can have more airspace, and we can have a healthier soil because our microbial populations are better because of practices that we do and we are in control of. So things that cause short root systems. Heavy nitrogen will certainly do it. We'll get a lot of shoot growth at the expense of root growth, or fertilizing fairly heavily at the wrong time of the year can result in that as well. Drainage, we've talked about that. The lack of oxygen in the soil is going to limit your root growth. Too much thatch, they'll just grow in that thatch layer. Compaction, we've talked about that several times. Short mowing height. Typically, the lower that we mow, the shorter our root system is. And so that's something to think about. Yeah, you know, a short field plays good, it's fast, but you know, we're going to have to do a lot more management on that field because of that short mowing height. Low pH is going to affect our rooting. Chemicals and pests obviously can affect rooting, and then really hot soils can affect rooting as well. So all of those things, most of those things we have control over. We can impact our roots if they are shallow. We can play with all of these things on this list and try and get our roots deeper. So when we're irrigating, our goal is to, on average, be in a field capacity type situation. And so we want to balance between, you know, we want water, we want air spaces, we want the plant to have the best of all worlds. And so field capacity is just that. There's air spaces and there's water spaces. And so what we really want to do when we irrigate is fill the soil up until the point where the water on the surface is starting to run off. So our soil should be saturated. Then it's going to drain the excess out, and we're going to be left in this field capacity situation where we've got air spaces and we've got plenty of water hanging around on those soil particles. And then as water is pulled out of the soil from evaporation or transpiration through the plant, it eventually gets depleted until it's down to this state right here where we're at this permanent wilting point. At this point, the secret is fill it back up with water, let it excess drain out, go back through this process again. So once you start seeing those footprints on your grass, or you know, you do your moisture probes, or you feel to see how wet it is or whatever, you know, doing this as the field dries out, that's your best bet for producing roots. And so we call that deep and infrequent irrigation. Fill it up, let it drain, let it get dry, fill it back up. So our ideal situation there under deep and infrequent, we've got a vigorous and deep root system. If it's too wet, we've got roots at the top. Roots just can't grow. There's no oxygen to allow them to grow. Lack of moisture, the plant will send out roots looking for moisture, and maybe in this drawing it finds a little bit deep down there. But if the plant, it's eventually going to run out of energy if there's no water to give to the plant. And then light watering. So this issue right here, if you're just watering a little bit every day, we're going to have some surface feeder roots, and we're going to have a weaker root system down through the rest of the soil. So the problem is, you think back to Georgia back, I don't know, 15 years ago, whenever it was, where there was a huge drought, their irrigation lakes were all drying up, and there was a ban on washing cars and watering grass. And if you had been watering lightly like this, and all of a sudden you are not allowed by law to use any water on your grass, what happens? You're in trouble. But if you've got a deep, vigorous system like this, you're probably going to go a lot longer before that plant starts to get into problems. All right, early morning, the best time to irrigate because it's usually less windy at that time of the day. So your water is actually going where you want it to go. Ideally, and this doesn't obviously work out if you're on a pump or something like that, but we want to irrigate as close to the morning as possible because our leaves are not wet all night. Wet leaves will cause or increase our disease pressure. If there's dew in the mornings, that's a good thing to knock off because dew is a good thing for disease pressure as well. Diseases will love nutrient-rich dews. And then there's obviously no people when we're irrigating at that time of the morning as well, typically anyways. All right, but pay attention. Like I said, feel your soil, pull it up and have a look at it. Use a soil moisture meter, whatever you need to do to kind of get a handle on how wet is my soil? When should I irrigate? These things are very important. And depending on if you're sandy like this, or if you've got a native soil, you're going to have totally different values, but you need to keep up with, your wilting point in the sand is going to be completely different from a native soil, but keep up with how much water to put on, how long in between, depending on time of year and wind and sun and all of that stuff. That's going to help dry things out. So things to think about with irrigation. So pay attention to your root depths. So I like to use a slab sampler and just pull samples and just see how things are looking. Do I have deep roots? You can, depending on what kind of soil you have, you can figure out how much soil or how much water will my soil hold. Be careful with your fertility. Like I said, too much will cause a short root system. Obviously, don't put crazy amounts on at one time. Water until the soil is filled, and as soon as it starts to run off or starts to puddle a little bit, stop it. Obviously, we don't want percolation losses, and so if you've got a very porous soil like a sand, and it just keeps pouring through, you're going to be washing everything else through that soil as well. And so something else to think about. Deeply, but infrequently, like we talked about, and then watering in the morning. All right, mowing really quickly before I run out of time. So really important things. Obviously, this is one of those things that we don't give a lot of thought to, but it's really important for us, right? Because we can have the height of the grass where we want it to be, whether it's 3/4 of an inch, whether it's 2 inches, whatever it is, we can set a height and we can keep it there. And that affects our playability. And so depending on what sports you're managing or what your budget is, your playability is going to be impacted by your mowing height. Aesthetics, obviously, as you can see there with the stripes, is going to be impacted by mowing, and then density as well. And I'll show you an example of that right here. So when we mow grass short, what happens? So we get better density. So look at this tall fescue on the bottom right here. I've got that mowed at 1 inch versus 3.5 inches on the left here. And that density is much, much better on the right where it's mowed short than it is on the left. We've got a smaller leaf here on the right as well. Much better leaf size. Same grass, exactly same variety, just mowed at a different height. We've also got a darker green grass on the right than we do on the left, because as we mow shorter, chlorophyll increases per unit area on that leaf and the plant becomes more dark. So there's no fertility differences on these things. Exact same day, exact same conditions, just one was mowed shorter, and we can see the benefits there. So the things that we don't like though with the shorter mowing height is there's less carbohydrate production. So photosynthesis is going to slow down at least at some point. Maybe once that chlorophyll starts to increase, it can catch back up. But initially, we're going to have a somewhat reduced carbohydrate production from photosynthesis. We're going to have shorter roots, and we're going to have less rhizome production. And that's an important thing to think about as well, because that's where we get our recovery from on grasses like Bermuda grass and Kentucky bluegrass. And so if we got a short grass that's not producing much for rhizomes, our recovery is not going to be spectacular. All right, so things to think about our BMPs for mowing. So it looks great when we mow short, but you've got to think about, I'm going to have to do more work if I mow it short. So there's going to be a higher amount of work for me to keep these grasses happy if they're mowed short. They're going to need more irrigation because of the shorter root system, and they're going to be less tolerant to stresses. And so I'm going to have to, again, baby these plants because I'm mowing them shorter. And so again, there's pros and cons to a lot of the things we do, but maybe finding the happy medium is the thing that we need to do. Defoliation, this is some work from the 1950s. What happens if you mow too short? So you've all heard of the 1/3 mowing rule, that if you mow 33% of the leaf off at one time, you're in good shape. But if you start mowing off more than that, you can have some impacts on the root system. And so as you can see there, as you take 40 or 50 or 60% off, the root system is really impacted. And so I'd say, during the spring or the summer on a cool season grass, or spring or fall on a cool season grass, or summer on a warm season grass, probably not that big of a deal. But if you do this in the summertime where you cut off way too much leaf material on a cool season plant that's already struggling, that's already not photosynthesizing very well, how easy is it for that plant to reproduce its root system if we have injured it from taking too much leaf material off at one time? And so pay attention to those things. Be careful with how we manage our plants. Keep your mower sharp is very important as well. For pathogens getting in those jaggedy cuts, they look bad. Obviously, it costs more for fuel use because your mowers actually have to work harder to cut through with dull blades. You'll use more fuel because of that, and you can have stunted grasses because of that as well. All right, I'm going to finish up with a couple slides here. Grass seeds, really quickly. This is one of the things I see that gets messed up more often than not when we're planting, because we've got such huge seed size differences. Look at Kentucky bluegrass there versus tall fescue. We can't plant everything at the same depth. I went out to an athletic field a couple of years ago where they were complaining about seed not germinating, and we talked about, well, how deep did you plant? And the sports turf manager said, well, I planted at 3/4 of an inch. And I was, well, that's way too deep for Bermuda grass, which is a really small seed. And so paying attention to how deep you're planting is very important, because there's only so much stored energy in the seed for that leaf to get to the surface before it can start photosynthesizing and making energy for the plant. If it runs out before it makes it to the surface, it doesn't have a chance. And so seeds to germinate have to have adequate moisture, not too much, but it certainly needs to be moist. There needs to be oxygen as well, like we've talked about. Temperature obviously is going to be important, and depending on what plants we're growing, Bermuda grass in 70-ish degrees, and cool season grass is much cooler. And then after these plants germinate, we've got to think about keeping moisture to them. And then, do we need to fertilize? What's going on with that stuff, and what's going on in the soil with our oxygen levels and that sort of thing. All right, and I'm going to finish up with this. Pest management. So we've kind of skirted around some pest stuff today. I've talked around this topic, but to kind of finish this up, a lot of our pest management comes down to proper maintenance. You got to remember, right? We are turfgrass managers. We are not pest managers. And so if we are turfgrass managers, as part of our process of paying attention to and being good stewards of our turf, hopefully a lot of our pest problems will become less and less. And so proper maintenance, all those things I've talked about, aerification, watering properly, paying attention to your growth of the plants for fertility and things like that. All of that stuff are the things that we need to focus on. Getting our thick turf, you've heard about that before. A thick, healthy turf is your best bet against pests. And then I've got pesticides listed on here. I'm not saying that pesticides are bad or we shouldn't use them or anything like that, because I know they're an important tool in the arsenal to keep fields looking good. But let's pay attention to those other things that matter so much. If this is your grass, if it's that thick, how in the world can weeds germinate in that and come through there? And you look at this where there's some disease on Bermuda grass, and you can see that light green grass there is all crabgrass coming in. And there's some crabgrass in other areas of this photo, but most of it is in those spots where there's no competition. And so keep your competition up to keep your weeds at bay. And then the disease triangle, you've probably seen this before too, but to get disease on plants, all three legs of this triangle has to be present. And so the pathogen has to be in the soil. The environment has to be favorable. And typically for most of our turf diseases, it means humid and hot. And then the host has to be susceptible. And that typically means a stressed out plant, right? So our cool season grasses that are hot and dry and photorespiring in the summertime are usually our bad, can't come up with a word, our plants that get hammered the worst because they're susceptible to disease because they're weak at that time of the year. And so by doing these things, by maintaining our grasses properly to try and take that host out of this equation, that's what we really want to do. Using new genetics can be another way that grasses that have built-in disease tolerance are a good way to manage this as well, to take the host out of the equation. But we can obviously take the pathogen out of the equation with a fungicide, But a lot of times when we apply a fungicide, we are going to be killing microbes in the soil with that fungicide application. And so pay attention to your host, get it as healthy as possible to take it out of this equation so we don't get disease on grass. Again, the whole goal with this proper maintenance thing is to have this sign out there a lot less often if we can possibly do it. All right, and with that, I appreciate your time and hope you all have a great rest of your week. If you have any questions, I am happy to chat with you.
Thank you, Dr. Munshaw, for that valuable presentation. This will be recorded and posted on the SFMA website as well as in our library. We also thank you for our attendees, and we have Dr. Munshaw's information there for follow-up. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your week.